hyder o bros y brosiar a tyfech lle roes i'm sech yn gynnar.
I first thought about getting older about 10 years ago, peeping through a tiny window of a crogloft cottage on a mountainside in North Wales. This was where my Welsh grandmother Catherine was born and lived her life until she married. Looking through the window and seeing the ladder that led to the crogloft, I felt a passionate desire to know about Catherine, and I wanted Hannah, my granddaughter, to know about me. Catherine, what did she do every day? Not big things, but small details, the things that are never written down. Domestic things. She was poor. Poverty was taken for granted in rural Wales in the 1880s. The cottage would not have looked as it does today as a second home in the 1990s. A crogloft cottage looks like a gingerbread house, a small front door with a window either side. Inside there would be a living room, lit by an oil lamp at night, a slate floor, and a black-leaded range where a kettle would be on the boil at all times. Out of this living room would be a ladder to the loft, and here all the children would sleep on the floor, as many as a dozen. To the left of the front door would be a small bedroom where the mother and the father would sleep, and outside a small cowshed and pigsty. Oh, that Catherine had written down her life just one day, how she did her washing, what she cooked, what happened when she was ill, what did she think of sex, and did she speak English? I know she had an illegitimate daughter while still at home, who would have lived in the cottage with all of them. I knew she then married James Ellis, who was himself illegitimate, and that she moved to another crogloft cottage, and they had 9 children of their own. James died at 42. There wouldn't have been any money coming into the home, but the boys would have begun work on the farms at 12 or 13, and the girls sent away to service as my mother was. Catherine died, probably of exhaustion, in 1929, when she was 52 and I was 9 months old. It means a lot to me that she saw me. I have such strong feelings for her and her life as a woman. My mother continued her life in innocence, I always think. No feminism to throw light on how she felt she had to serve people all her life. As I grow older, I want to find threads from Catherine to Hannah, the contrasting images. Catherine always in dark, long clothes, my mother in her pinny, me in my denim, Hannah with her wonderful African hair plaited in dozens of plaits and in her trainers and tights. The thread of childbirth. Besides Catherine giving birth to 10 children, there would have been many deaths at that time, both babies and mothers. My mother giving birth to me spent days in labour to produce a 10-pound baby. Gas and air? Well, maybe. My youngest son born by caesarean section with me fully conscious with an epidural block in my spine. How will Hannah give birth in 10 years or so? Different influences. Chapel would have played a huge part in Catherine's life. Religion plays no part at all in mine. I can see where I come from has moulded me. Catherine wouldn't have heard of feminism, but it has helped me place myself. What will influence Hannah? For now, I'll keep going back, looking through the cottage window, searching for threads that join us.
Gwyn yn haddi pawb o'i chwmpas, ni fyn swn gredu'n dyn byw, nad oedd i ryw anghyles.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Stephen Burke, and I was co-chair of Grandparents Plus with Jean from 2010, and a fellow trustee of the charity, obviously along with Jean, since 2003. It's my pleasure to act tonight as the link person for the whole of this evening's event. I knew Jean for about 15 years, but I'm conscious that many of you actually knew her for much longer, and I hope tonight really does reflect many of your memories of Jean. I'm afraid before we start, I have to do some very basic housekeeping. Hopefully by now most of you have found where the bathrooms are outside off the main foyer, and there are emergency exits either through the way you came in, out into Red Lion Square, and obviously down this end just by the stage as well. Can I also start by thanking the organisers of this evening's event, Jean's sons, Philip, Andrew, and particularly Mark, who's done a huge amount of work to put this event together, and Jean's granddaughter, Grace, who we will hear from in a moment. Many thanks also, particularly, to Peter Dunbar, who has worked on behalf of Grandparents Plus with real dedication to make this event happen. Many thanks, Peter. And thank you also to Sam Smethers, the Chief Executive of Grandparents Plus, who has worked behind the scenes to ensure that we create something really memorable for Jean. And I'm sure that what follows will be a really special event. And finally, in terms of thanks, many thanks to the Young Foundation, to Jean's family and to Grandparents Plus, who between them have covered the costs of this evening's event. Let me start by saying that this evening is an appreciation event. I'm sure it will be emotional, but it will also be a celebration of Jean's life and Jean's work, remembering the past, but also with an eye to the future. And I think that's just as Jean would have done and would have wanted. Speaking personally, for me, Jean was a pioneer and an inspiration, and really ahead of her time. Actually, I think she was a baby boomer before the baby boomers. She led the way as an older woman, campaigning on a range of issues that we will hear about this evening. She achieved more in her 70s and in her 80s than many of us do in a lifetime. And for Jean, I think this is really important, for Jean, the personal was always political. As she lived what she said through her family and through her multi-generational approach to life. And she loved being with people of all ages. And I think in these insular times, Jean was also a true internationalist, obviously loving Wales, of course, as we've heard, but also being inspired by and inspiring colleagues from other countries and sharing learning from organisations like Generations United in the United States. Of course, Jean co-founded Grandparents Plus. As her co-chair, I can say without any doubt that without Jean, the charity would not be here today and wouldn't be in such good health. Jean led the charity through some very lean times, and she kept the flame burning throughout that time through her ambition for children and families, her tenacity and determination, and dare I say it on occasions, her sheer stubbornness and her bravado. Jean left Grandparents Plus on a real high, literally, watching the BBC television appeal that was broadcast just days before she died, and having secured funding for some key work with local authorities to develop kinship care. Both of those things are really key to the charity's future. And Jean's ambitions, I know, included reaching out to all 14 million grandparents in this country, getting proper recognition and proper support for those grandparents. The other personal thing for me is that Jean was great at sending cards. And I'm sure many of you got cards from Jean at various points in your life. The card that Jean sent me after we first met is still on my office wall, and it featured Margaret Mead's quotation, which I think resonates throughout this appreciation of Jean, and that quotation is, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever does." And I think that's certainly what Grandparents Plus has been all about. And Jean was also always a wonderful host, as those of you who attended her parties at home will know. And she would have wanted us to have a bit of a party tonight, as well as an appreciation, and to meet both new and old friends during the evening. It's also fitting that we're here tonight at Conway Hall. It's a venue that Jean visited many times, and no doubt many of you have visited here too. One of Jean and Bill's early friendships in Barnet was with Lord Fenner Brockway, whose statue I hope you passed in Red Lion Square on your way in. When they were neighbours in Barnet, Fenner Brockway would call in for a whisky after a day in the House of Lords, and it was all part of Jean's journey to becoming a committed socialist and a feminist. So it's therefore only fitting that we are here to celebrate Jean's life this evening. And I can actually imagine now Jean sitting there in the front row, ready to ask the first question, as she always did. Throughout this evening, we're going to hear from many people who knew Jean, and we will hear from Jean herself, like we've just heard, through interviews that were conducted in her later years. The evening's in 4 parts, focusing on key turning points in Jean's life, from home, family and friends, to social work, Grandparents Plus and kinship care. In part 1, we focus on Jean's home and family, with contribution on Jean's parents, her evacuation to Wales during the war, and also meeting her husband Bill. We will hear from 2 of Jean's oldest friends, Gay Hudson via video and Shirley Eaton, but we begin first by hearing from Jean's granddaughter, Grace Gabriel Stogdon. Here's Grace.
Wow, there is a lot of people here. Good evening, everybody. I've met many of you before, but for those of you that I don't know, my name is Grace and I'm one of Jean's 4 grandchildren, and also 2, soon to be 3, great-grandchildren. Touching on many of Stephen's points as well, on behalf of the rest of the family and Grandparents Plus, I wanted to thank you, significant people in Gina's life, for coming today to join us in an appreciation. From a glance at the programme, you can see that this really is an exploration of her life, from what she conceived as the best and most rewarding of times to some of the hardest, allowing us to explore what shaped her into the woman that we knew. So rather than us guide you through Gina's life, and also in the spirit of her undoubtedly wanting to lead her own appreciation, you'll see sections of AB pulled from recordings of Jean from the last year, where she guides us through significant times. And for some clarification before we begin, the Grandad Vegetables referred to was Bill's father, called so because of the common garden connection. He wasn't actually a grandad made of vegetables. Once again, thank you very much for coming this evening, and I'll let Gina take over and tell you her story.
So tell us what you think your relationship was like with your dad. What was he like, and what was he like as a father?
Well, he was a wonderful father. I would say he was a wonderful father. I don't forget I was his first child. I think that's very important. So I always felt very special to him. I suppose he was, in some ways, you'd say, a Victorian. His father had been a Victorian, very upright, hard work. You put your children to apprenticeships. And Dad was like that. He was very, very disciplined, very disciplined. I mean, the examples are that if the paper or anything went up half a p, if he couldn't afford it, he wouldn't have it. So he would sort of deprive himself, but it never felt, I knew about it, that he gave up the newspaper or gave up something, but he never would feel deprived somehow. He was very, very jolly, he was very humorous, he told terribly corny jokes, but above all he was hard-working. I shouldn't think he was ever late for work, and he was just a lovely man.
Okay, so to think about your mum when you were growing up, what was she like?
It's very difficult to describe your parents when they're not, when they don't talk much. I mean, Mum, again, was just herself all the time. I mean, you know, there were no sort of pretences about them at all. They were just themselves. And of course, Mum was, I always imagine in their marriage, you know, she was the one that provided the warmth and probably the passion. The house was like she was. She warmed it. She got up and the fire was always going in the grate. So the essential things that a child would feel, you know, the warmth, and that you had good food, a good plain food, and that it was warm and, you know, caring, those things were there.
Glad gwaelda chan torion and wopion ovi. Ein gurora velwit glad garwyr tramor. O byddedir hen iau barhau. Glad.
So Gay, perhaps you could say how you knew Mum, how you knew Jean.
Yes, well, we first met in 1988 when we were swimming. So we were both swimming in Copthall. Jean had just retired and I was working in Barnet. And basically I had the same job in Barnet that Jean had had in Camden. And I remember we were talking in the locker rooms, and we seemed to be getting on very well, and Jean suddenly said to me, "Are you a social worker?" And I said, "Oh, Jean, is it written on my forehead?" And from then on, we met most mornings when we were swimming until, I suppose the 1990s, when I moved to a different pool. But then we met weekly to keep up our friendship. Yes, so Jean's family came from, or her mother's family, came from North Wales, and I was born and brought up in South Wales. Jean was always asking questions. She was good at asking questions. She was always very curious. And I think one of the big things that we were both good at was sharing about our families. And we were open to each other. And I think what I had with Jean that I haven't got with other friends, maybe, or not so much, is that Jean and I could really disagree about quite big things sometimes, not only politics or whatever, which we generally agreed on, but maybe family relationships we could actually talk in depth about, disagree, agree to disagree and move on. And that was really wonderful because we felt we were being honest, we were connected, and we could laugh. We often laughed about our differences, but we could have some really good times. Yes, they were very rich times for me, and I learnt a lot. I mean, I think one of the things, I'm sure Jean's other friends will say this, I learnt a lot from Jean about life, really, about taking people in context. We were heavily involved looking after Dick's father into his late 90s. And it was about taking people in context and remembering where they'd come from. And that was a good lesson to learn. I'd just like to introduce a turning point of when Jean was evacuated to Wales during the war. It was really at a very crucial time for Jean, and it obviously mattered. It was a big thing, you know, how Jean was telling me, because it changed the course of her life at that stage.
I had gone down there
just before I was 11 and had failed to take the 11 plus, which was called the scholarship. The timing was just awful for me because I hadn't taken it in London, and then the months I was down there in Wales at the beginning of the war, I had to take it then, and of course I couldn't speak Welsh, so of course I didn't pass the scholarship. And then when I got back to London, it was all over, and the division between children going to grammar school and the secondary modern was already decided, and I was for the secondary modern.
Her Uncle Will was headmaster at the school, and he gave her a crash course in Welsh, but it wasn't enough. I think for Jean, when she arrived in Wales, what she was saying was that suddenly she was in a different sort of environment.
For me, you know, being a bright child but sort of uneducated, you know, it was a house with books in and the feeling of learning. And Uncle Will always had, as I do now, we all do as we get older, he had his own armchair, and the surround of the fireplace was slate, and he always had chalk in his pocket, and if he was telling you something, he would be drawing it on the slate surround of the fireplace, which was always quite interesting. I do remember when we went home, you know, we didn't have very much at home, but they bought a little table tennis table, and I sort of can remember feeling their absolute sort of joy of having us home again, you know, playing in the garden and that sort of thing. I remember strongly that feeling of going home.
Both of us agreed that we were loved unconditionally, which was hugely important for both of us. But I did have this education tag, which took me places which Jean didn't have, and that I think was really, really important. So when the opportunity came for her to train in social work, I mean, that really was the beginning, I think, and she thinks, or thought, where she took off, really. And, you know, she was obviously a bright woman. And one of the things that I loved about her was that she was in awe of no one. She would, yes, I learnt, again from Jean, because she was willing to put her head above the parapet where a lot of people play safe. She was never in awe of anyone. If she wanted to speak to David Cameron, who was in the same room, many of us would have, you know, skulked about at the back of the queue, but not Jean. She would always go forward. So I think I think that education that she had in her 40s opened up a huge new life for her, and she made jolly good use of it. You know, a lot of people benefited from Jean's education, really. Yeah.
Thanks, Guy.
Excuse me reading from notes, won't you? It is an honour to say a few words about my friend Jean. I met her well over 50 years ago through mutual friends. Like Jean, my early childhood education was sorely inadequate through reasons not unlike hers. I have tried throughout my life to make up for those missing pages. When I first met her, she was a wife and mother of 3 sons, and I was busy working, but I loved to visit her between filming, mainly because with Jean it was like being home. I could visit her at any minute's notice, and she was always there to give me gentle advice about babies, etc., etc. Her warmth and caring shone through like a beacon, her calm strength in particular. I had no idea in those early days of our friendship that she would spread her love, stamina, and caring to so many families and children. As our friendship developed and the years began to pass, unfortunately, we didn't see each other for months. We were both so busy with our careers, but never did I feel our friendship was fading away. That's how it was with Jean. In the middle years, I saw her and Bill struggle with the effects of her changed lifestyle, being devoted to her work and at the same time the loving mother and wife she had always been to them and still was to the best of her ability, and the tension that caused. Always the dilemma that strikes most women's hearts to this very day, not to mention my own inner struggle with these issues. My husband and I would often visit Bill and Jean in the evenings to argue over each other's point of view, and they were great lessons in that worthy saying, agree to disagree, and still remain friends and spouses. Then Father Time came along, caught up with us, and our lives, sadly, we both lost our lifetime mates. In the years that followed, Jean and I became very close and shared many ideas about family life and what it all meant, right to the end. I love and honour Jean without reservation for the courageous woman she was, her achievements and all that she stood for, and I miss her terribly. Now I would like to introduce the second turning point in her life, when she met Bill and the family life that followed.
So Dad went to this new school that had been built in Russell Lane. They built the two buildings, one side girls, one side boys. And Dad had gone to that school, and of course that was the school I went to when I came back from being evacuated. And in the middle was a kitchen where they sorted out the milk. And I've got a memory of Dad. That was the first time. So that would have been before I was 14. What happened after most of us left school, we all joined a youth club. That's where I really got to know Dad. First of all, he was better dressed than anybody. He'd come from the West End, and Grandad Vegetables was very, very smart. And he'd always had lovely clothes. I mean, they used to buy their clothes, and then later on in Moss Brothers, Grandad used to buy his clothes. And he was very tall, and unusually had a very long neck. There was something sort of tall and skinny about him. So Dad used to walk me home, and we used to sit on that seat. There was a seat where you come up Ossage Lane and it turns into Russell Lane. Start of Brunswick Park Road, there was a seat there, and we used to sit on that seat. And then he used to come right along to cemetery gates, and sometimes it was very late. And I remember one memorable night when Nana came down, and she said it's something like, it's 11 o'clock, what are you doing down here? And do you know she's only 14, 15 or 16 or something like that? And I was most horribly embarrassed. But, you know, from then on, I mean, I didn't want a serious relationship. I mean, I just would never have thought of it in a million years. I was still, you know, playing netball on Saturdays and, you know, still really longing to be at school, honestly. And, but Dad absolutely was sure that I was the one for him for life. And, you know, he totally pursued me until we got engaged when I was 17.
Girl of my dreams, I love you, honest I do. You are so sweet. If I could just hold your charms again in my arms, then life would be complete.
summer I went swimming, this summer I might have drowned, but I held my breath and I kicked my feet and I moved my arms around, moved my arms around. This summer I swam in the ocean and swam in a swimming pool. Salt my wounds, cleaned my eyes, I'm a self-destructive fool, self-destructive fool. Summer I did the backstroke, and you know that that's not all. I did the breaststroke and the butterfly and the old Australian crawl, the old Australian crawl. This summer I swam in a public place and a reservoir to boot. At the latter I was informal, at the former I wore my suit, I wore my swimming suit, yeah. Summer I did swan dives and jackknives for you all. And once when you weren't looking, I did a cannonball, did a cannonball. This summer I went swimming, this summer I might have drowned, but I held my breath and I kicked my feet and I moved my arms around, moved my arms around.
Now we turn to the events that led to Jean training to become a social worker. That all began tragically with the death of her fourth child, a baby daughter who was stillborn. Here we'll be hearing from Sue Leither about Jean's time with Camden Social Services. Observer leader writer Yvonne Roberts, who many of you will know, wrote a particularly moving obituary of Jean for The Guardian, will chair a discussion with some of Jean's contemporaries, Hayley Argent, Amanda Hewitt and Susie Essex, who trade alongside Jean and remain some of her closest friends for the rest of her life. In this conversation, Yvonne and the others will be exploring Jean's transition from home to work through the prism of the feminist movement of the late 1960s. But first, we begin with a short film of Jean talking about the loss of her daughter and social work.
So what was that like when you discovered you were pregnant in 1965?
Well, I just took it in my stride. I think that I was very happy having children. I mean, how I had them wasn't particularly ideal, but I was very happy having children. I mean, 4 children would have been fine. And of course it was a girl, Katie M we were going to call her, Katie Emma. But tragedy struck when on one morning I got into the bath, and the baby always jumped about a lot when you're in the bath, and the baby wasn't moving. I knew it's not called stillborn for nothing. They tried to bring it away by chemical means, injections but my womb or uterus wouldn't work. So at 8 o'clock at night they did a cesarean, and I always think that this is, it must have been tired staff or something or other, because they left a big swab in me, which nearly killed me in the end. There wasn't any system then for sort of this situation. In fact, they rather wanted to hide me away. But the whole thing from then on, feeling terrible, feeling as though I'd got flu all the time, of course, was the swab, but, doctor said, oh, this is grief. It's too much to describe, like how you feel. So, you never get over it. You never get over it. have absolute transforming points in your life. Losing the baby was a transforming moment in a huge way, because it sort of marked, and of course I forgot to say I was sterilised then, because there wasn't any question of me having more children. So that was a transforming moment, because that was the end of something. You know, it was the end of a stage of life. I had been here for all those years, up to 1969, when I went on the course, servicing the family. I mean, you know, the family knew nothing else but the fact that I did everything. And so, you know, when services are removed, obviously, you know, that makes an enormous difference. And I had the double shift. I was doing a big career, and I had everything to do still. I was attempting to do everything, because I had promised that nothing would change. So, I mean, you know, I was the person carrying the biggest burden, and everybody else was in some ways inconvenienced, really. I think I put it like that. The impact was enormous, and funnily enough, some of the most resistance I had was from the women in the road. One said, "Oh, don't worry, Bill, I'll get you some dinner if she's not in." You know, they were sort of making a joke of it, but they're really saying you're not going to be able to do it all. And the other thing, one of them said to me, aren't you worried about neglecting your family? Well, as I'd worked full-time for 18 years doing it, and really it wasn't on my agenda to neglect the family, which indeed the family would say they were not neglected, I'm sure. It was more or less service as usual, either through me or from Nana. The whole of family life, and my life, of course, and Dad's life, that don't forget he hadn't really known what it was going to be like, so he'd signed up for something that he didn't like in the end, and I must say, I don't think he liked me as much. You know, he always used to sort of say, if we went out to met people, out to dinner or something, you know, he would always say, "Oh, isn't she a nice woman?" And she was always a housewife. You know, she was always sort of being what he wanted me to be, back in the kitchen, really. Mm-hmm. But, you know, I thought, well, it's my turn. I'm not doing anything nasty. I'm going to contribute economically to the family, and I'm finding out who I am and what my potential is and what my capabilities are. Mm-hmm. Which, of course, you know, when I got to Camden, I found that my capabilities were pretty enormous. I think the highlight of the course was the experience we had together. Like just was like paradise for me. First of all, there was a library. You know, you sat around having conversations and arguments. I think that was the richness of the course, was where everybody had come from. Some had just left university. Some were very, very clever, and some of us, as I said, had life experience. And life experience, I have to give credit, counted for a lot. Really, it was sort of, had you got the confidence to do it. And then we all met in the pub at lunchtime. And I remember Keith Farmer, who could only have been in his 20s then, but he had worked in residential, knew far more about the kids that came into care and everything. I didn't know anything about that. And I remember him saying, "What are they doing having silly old cows like you on this course?" Like, "What do you know about social work?" which I reminded him of years later when I was his boss. But there we are, it's another story.
Can I hand over now to Yvonne Roberts with Hayley Argent, Susie Essex and Amanda Hewitt up on stage, who will take us through the next one.
Thank you very much. Thanks. If Jean would have absolutely loved this, she would have made a few changes and improved things, obviously, but she would have really loved it, so it's a great honour. For about the last 12 years of Jean's life, we would meet in the cafe in the British Library, where she would proceed to tell me off for something I'd written. all the time making me feel I was being complimented. And even though my dad came from North Wales, that didn't really save me. So she was quite extraordinary. And one of the things she was very extraordinary about was, I realised as I got to know her that she was in middle age in the 60s. And you know, they say about middle age that the narrow waist and the broad mind somehow changes place. And Jean actually had the broadest mind that I'd ever come across, really. And in the 60s, as I'm sure we've got an amazing panel here, what's extraordinary about all of these women is that in the 60s, when Jean sadly lost her baby, it was only the year after married women were allowed to keep half their allowance in law. The abortion law had only just been passed. Equal pay hadn't come into force. There were no women's history. There was no women's studies. There was no Ms. was seen. If you said you wanted to be called Ms., you were regarded as completely off your trolley. And this was all for women in their teens and 20s, as I was. For the people on the panel here who were heading towards middle age, it was incredible that they actually challenged and carved a different kind of life for themselves. So what we want to explore really is what Jean used to have this saying about having transformative moments, and at the age of nearly 40, to leave the home and take on a new profession in spite of objections, and ironing apparently 19 shirts a week for her husband, is quite something. So I just want to ask each Susie, Heidi and Amanda where they were in the 60s and what their connection was with Jean. So if I can begin with any one of you, yeah.
I'm in a slightly different role because I was at Jean's transformation, mainly around the loss of the baby and the loss of my mother. But the impact of Jean going on the course was huge because I sat in front of her Aga listening to everything she learned. So all those conversations would come back and changed my life. I was meant to be a geography teacher or a PE teacher, became a social worker, and have taken her influences across the world, genuinely, to Australia, Aboriginal people, First Nation people in Canada, have benefited because of her course.
What do you think was the trigger between her losing Katie Emma and the social work?
I think, for me, because I'd just lost my mother, for her, she knew there was no going back, that was like a fault line in her story about herself as a mother. And suddenly, this whole world changed and opened up. And I learned that too, that once you've had a significant loss, life has to be different. So I will hand over to
Heidi,
people who were actually alongside her.
Heidi, you were at the North London Poly, manning the barricades, were you not?
Well, sort of. But I mean, Jean and I were the two oldies. There was one woman actually who was a year older than us, and then it was Jean, and then it was me. And we were considerably older than all the rest of the course. And that was what was wonderful. We were part of it. I felt as much at ease with the young ones as I did with Jean, and I know Jean did. And I think Jean mentioned that the group was great. And we felt part of something that I think we thought we never could be. It was like a new beginning for us. A new start in life, and certainly for me it was, because I changed careers, and I wasn't as housebound as Jean had been, and I came on the course with much more kind of support from my family, so that we had a lot of discussions about how this could be and the differences, and I was amazed to hear that Jean ironed sheets. I'd never ironed a sheet in my life. I heard later that she even ironed napkins and tea towels. And I mean, you know, this was a kind of life that I knew nothing about. But Jean knew it, loved it, and maintained it, and yet made this enormous leap into the group.
How do you think it influenced her role as a social worker? Because you could obviously see that there was a women's story that sometimes didn't get told.
Oh, I think she was almost painfully aware of women's lives in a way that only her experience had given her. And as she said, all her feelings about her grandmother and her mother, all that played an enormous part in her development and in the way she looked at women. And she taught me a great deal about working with women.
Amanda, you worked with Jean.
I never worked with Jean.
I
never worked with her at all.
Yeah.
But our lives were ran on parallel lines in a sense. She was always more ambitious. I went into social work a little later than she did, and I envied her greatly because she had her mother who stepped into the house and looked after the children, and I didn't have that. And I had to train 5 years evening classes and then 1 year full-time, whereas she was able to dive straight in. And, you know, I thought that was a very enviable way of doing it, of changing your lifestyle, really, in a quite a dramatic way. But our friendship developed in a different way. We met in the playground at primary school. I'd known her for something like 59 years. And she's my dearest friend. We had children of a comparable age in primary school. We had husbands who were a mix of, you know, good and bad. We had moans about our marital situations, but we survived them. And that really went on for a long while, all the time, really, until we were both widowed. We went to, after the school playground era, we started going swimming together at Kentish Town because our children were being taught by Susie's father, and that was another source of an arena that we could use to chat and talk and share things.
How do you think that Jean navigated the situation with Bill? Because Bill obviously would have preferred her to have been a housewife.
Yes.
And Jean was very determinedly not going to do that, when she was a
Yes.
housewife plus.
Yeah, well, I can identify with that very strongly because I was in a similar situation. I mean, neither Jean or I had any support, active support from our husbands, and although, you know, they did what men were supposed to do at that time, which was earn the money, but not look after the babies. And so it was hard work. You know, you had to be two different people, more than two different people. You had to do your bit when you got home, and you had to somehow keep your head above water when you were studying. And when you were actually in the college situation as a student, you were, as Hades said, a different person, a person I very much struck by that remark of yours because I didn't think I could become that person. And I gradually realized I could, you know, and it was incredibly, incredibly liberating.
Heidi, why do you think feminism was so important to Jean? Because lots of women went into social work and lots of women didn't become feminists. Why was it so important to her?
Well, I think it was her experience at home and that she felt she was more than a housewife. And how was she going to do that? And, you know, it was the time, and we all read Simone de Beauvoir, and we were all aware of it, and we discussed it with our tutors, and we discussed it in the group, so that left-wing politics and feminism, that became part of our life. It became part of the course.
She stuck with it, though. She didn't give
And
it
she
up.
stuck with it. My goodness, she stuck with it, yes. And, you know, she went on amazingly, just amazingly. One of my last contacts with Jean was when she came out of hospital very briefly for just a few days before going back finally. And during that time, she wrote me a very long email complaining bitterly about a conference that was being put on about kinship care without her. And what was that about? And shouldn't I be doing something about it? And that was the last contact I had with her. But you know, she was feisty till the end, and that was wonderful.
She was. Well, listen, they say that you can't choose your relatives, but you can pick your friends, and these are 3 wonderful friends, so thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Now we have another short film of Jean, this time Jean reflecting on her years as a senior manager in Camden.
You become a therapist, but you're also in a local authority role which can take children into care. You can take the children away from them. So it's a policeman role. It's a very, very difficult role. But I think that we did it. We did preventive work. We prevented children coming into care. We had the lowest number of children in care, 300, which was the lowest, I think, in the country. I remember many, many clients, families, and one of my most famous, she was very, very low-functioning mum, we would have called her, bordering on learning disabled. I had to go down and visit this child in Kent. She wasn't going there at all because she felt so ashamed and inadequate. So I began planning to get this child back. I went with her to the Celiac Society, which is what social workers did in those days. I went in the evening with her to the Celiac Society so that she knew what she got to do. As we left the house where he'd been fostered, the 2 children said, "Good riddance to you." And when we got back to the flats, they put out all bunting and, you know, a huge welcome. As I left, she wrote me this amazing letter which said, which I've still got, which said, "My husband would have loved you." Which was very, very sad, really. But I mean, it was what social work was about in those days. I mean, you really did your best and changed people's lives. They had got rid of 3 area heads. First of all, I wasn't afraid of the job, and I sort of thought to myself, hang on a sec, I hadn't been on a management course at all. I said, you know, I know I've got a feel of what this is. It's like your adolescents at home, you know, adolescents that I brought up. You know, one minute they were grown-ups and one minute they were acting like children. So in the area meetings, which there were about 40 people, and I had to go through that every Wednesday, be bashed about the ears. They were like adolescents, you know, it was all my fault and blah, blah, blah. And then, you know, they would be in my room on particular cases, they would be in my room crying because of what was happening to them on particular cases. And I thought, and at other times, you know, they were absolutely lovely. And I thought, well, this is really just like they're behaving like adolescents because they're out of control, they're pushing the boundaries, all those things. So I thought, well, what I've got to do is just stick it out. You know, not cancel anything, meet them all the time, just go through it. And I noticed that all the team leaders that I appointed, I gradually got to realise that that's what they had to do when they're appointed in their teams. They had to go through a testing time with their teams. And if they didn't do that, they never got it right. But if they did it, went through it, and that's what I did, and that's how we got through it. And eventually, you know, it was an amazing workforce. You would find men doing sort of 3 years statutory sort of work in practice and then applying for jobs out of practice. And then rather saying, well, the trouble with women is they always want to practice. What I felt is that I knew every case that was on our child protection register. I thought I had to know them. And therefore, if a social worker was off sick and their team leader was on leave, I would keep a special eye on that situation because, you know, you knew that these mistakes can happen when the people were who couldn't keep a grip on it. And I personally could have gone out. I kept my hand that much in practice, which was not thought at the time to be very good. But don't forget that those days I didn't have to worry about budgets. That was all taken care of. So I kept very much in practice, in touch with the practice. And when we had child protection case conferences, and I chaired 200 in the last year I was there, with the education, the police, the health service and ourselves, we worked so well together. And if there was a wobbly social worker, we only need to look. And we didn't have to humiliate that person. We just, afterwards, I picked up and, made sure they were getting a bit of extra help. Because if their reporting to the case conference had not really hit the spot, something had to be done about it. They had reflective supervision through their team leaders, and then I had reflective supervision with the team leaders myself. And everybody demanded that. They would have gone to the union if they didn't have it, because they needed it. If you're doing work where you can get involved with such messy families and situations, you can lose yourself. So you have to be able to talk those things through. Again, something that's completely almost lost in social work today. They were quite a young workforce, and we didn't really talk much about end of life or what happens as you get older and all this sort of stuff. And so I had come across Lily Pincus, and I asked her one day if she'd come down and talk to our area meeting, which is usually, as I said, about 40 people there. And they all moaned and groaned a bit, we're too busy and what's all this about and all that. Anyway, they came, and she was so unbelievably intelligent, knowledgeable, empathetic, softly spoken, spoke with so much authority about loss and that sort of stuff. They were absolutely, they were practically in tears, and they got when it's getting across to people, because they went very quiet, and they all said afterwards, how valuable it had been. I said, well, can I give you a lift back? And she said, well, I'm meeting a friend up at Kenwood as it happens. So I said, oh, well, I can easily take you up there. And so on the way, I said to her, your family must be so proud of you. And she said, oh, no, she said, they're fed up with me. They think I'm always on about the same things. And like, for goodness sake, because she was pretty old, why don't you behave like an old person and all that sort of stuff. Rather similar to what I've been through myself.
I'm now going to be joined on stage by Sue Leifer. Sue worked with Jean in Camden, and Sue's going to tell us a bit about what it was like to work in Camden in those days and what it was like to work for Jean as well.
Thank you. I was one of those adolescents that she was talking about. Still am, I think. Jean was my very much loved area manager of famous and wonderful Area 3 in Camden. To be serious at first, her style of leadership was enabling and empathetic. She really cared about the client's welfare and also for the welfare of her staff. The values of the office came right from the top. She nurtured the team leaders and enabled them to care for us on the coalface. The supportive ethos was pervasive. And when you think of the stress levels in the work now, and how workers' stress today is uncontained, you long for the style of Jean Stogdon. She presided over a happy office in her Jaeger outfits, always bought in the sale. This is Marks and Spencer's, but it emulates her image. She could chat easily and warmly to anyone about her morning swims, her AGA, her bill, her boys, and our cases. Her door was always open, and she was always accessible. But we used to send her up something rotten about her grey areas. This was where a decision or a plan was not clear-cut, and a solution might take a while to emerge. It's taken me years to climb down from the send-up and realize that very few of our cases are clear-cut, and Jean's grey areas were really her ability to see both sides of a case, give parents and families the respect due to them, and give us the space to reflect. In retrospect, this was a necessity. These grey areas gave us great fun at our memorable Christmas parties. At one, we set up a blind date scenario with Cilla Black, and Jean was the contestant for a date. And Cilla said, "Hello, Chuck, what's your name?" And the social worker playing Jean said, "I'm Jean Stogdon." "And where do you come from, Chuck?" "I come from a grey area." "And what do you do, Chuck?" "Well, I go to lots of meetings and conferences, and I talk about priorities, and I support my team leaders, and I go swimming." So when we were taking the piss out of the grey areas, we were also noting that she did support us profoundly. Another Christmas had Jean as the Queen of Hearts at a Mad Hatter's tea party. The Queen of Hearts said, "Let's talk about the Knapsbury model." I can't remember what the Knapsbury model was, but it was one of her things, as was racism awareness and women's issues, which we used to call her flavours of the month. And then the Queen of Hearts would say, "Is one of my team leaders leaving because I haven't made my banquet for them yet?" And she did. She made dinner at home on her Aga for all her team leaders. She was so much loved and respected. And when she retired, only to go to other careers, we sang her this song, which actually I think I've probably only got time to do one verse of, but if over a jar you'd like the rest of it later, we could do that privately. "Hey, Jean, you are a queen. You've reigned supreme in this grey area. You swim here from Barnet every day. You show us the way when life is scarier. We'll miss the Speedo costume draped in your room. Hey, Jean."
Now we're going to turn to the part of Jean's life that many of us perhaps are most familiar with, when she founded Grandparents Plus in 2001 with that other pioneer, Lord Michael Young, and Jean's focus on kinship care as well, bringing us right up to the present day. In a few minutes, we're going to hear from Sue Connell, who is a member of Grandparents Plus Kinship Care Group for Professionals, and also from Maxine Campbell, who is a kinship carer and a member of our peer support network, which now reaches over 7,000 kinship carers right across the country. And there is a letter from Maxine, which you should have all been given when you arrived this evening. And Maxine will say a bit more about that in a moment. We're also going to be joined by John Simmons, Joan Hunt, Elaine Farmer, Elaine Arnold, and Anne Longfield, who are going to reflect a bit on Jean's contribution and her influence. And we're going to hear from Jean herself talking about founding Grandparents Plus and reflecting on the influence that Michael Young had on her. But first, we turn to another issue which was very close to Jean's heart, the need to challenge ageism. As I said at the beginning, Jean's thinking was really always ahead of her time, and a perfect example of this was when Jean featured on Esther Ranson's TV show, which was broadcast remarkably well over 20 years ago.
You can ask our helpline, and they'll point you in the right direction. Old age isn't something many people seem to be looking forward to. But is it old age, or just our view of it, that's frightening? Jean Stogdon, who filled out one of our surveys, has compiled a special report for us to show what the future feels like. And it isn't as grim as it sounds.
I don't want to do all that growing old stuff.
Growing old, no. Nor me, mate. Nor me.
No, when it comes, right? Yeah. When it comes, I want it just, you know, like that. Just, that's it. That's short, sharp, over, and everything finished.
Nothing dragged out.
No, nothing, all that lingering stuff.
Oh, no. Yeah. So, I mean, when would you ideally like to go?
Well, when I'm about 95.
Don't believe all you hear about growing older and what it's meant to be like. This is the CV that society's written for me, but it's not how I see myself.
pensioner, wrinkly, elderly. These are not powerful words, and it's not how I feel.
When I grow up, I wanna be an old woman. When I grow up, I wanna be an old woman. Oh, an old, no, 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 an old woman.
We live in a society obsessed by youth. Growing old is almost a crime, and it seems the only way to be accepted is to work hard at looking young. But to be honest, I'd rather spend my time and energy being my age. The only thing to get in my way is how you see me.
And now, here's the news for the elderly. Hello? Hello, dear. Yes, hello. Today, the Prime Minister, you know, nice girl, nice young girl who runs the country. Yes, Margaret, that's right, yes. You voted for her, you remember?
Are you making assumptions about me from the way I look? Why is it when you get grey hair and wrinkles, people stop asking your opinion, they stop listening to you, they stop noticing you? Just when you feel you've got most to say, you become completely invisible. Fascinating.
It's on my side. Yes, it is. It's on my side. Yes, it is.
With a camera, a little patience, and the right kind of film, you can find an image of love.
I just love that advert. Two old people really enjoying themselves. But I bet you think a little peck on the cheek would be more acceptable. Sex and old age are a bit of a turn-off, aren't they?
Now, what is the matter with you?
I think you know that only too well.
Are you somehow put out because I slept with Tom last night? Jane, how do you see me?
You're an icon.
Bollocks! I am a woman, thank God. For the last few years, I thought I was just an old person. But now, thanks to some cheap plonk and a fully functioning Tom Ballard, I am rediscovering the fact that I'm still firing on all cylinders and perfectly capable of going off like the proverbial rocket.
Oh! You don't suddenly go off sex when you're 60, any more than you suddenly become a miracle or a victim. Look in the papers, we're either marvellous for our age or frail and vulnerable, and inevitably we're grannies. In the magazines, we're practically invisible. If you do see older people, we're stereotypes. Why can't we advertise fashion and perfume and makeup? And as for television, there are hardly any presenters who've seen as many birthdays as I have.
When I get older, losing my hair, many years from now, will you still be sending me a Valentine, birthday greetings, bottle of wine?
The pressure on older people to keep young and beautiful is enormous. When was the last time you heard someone say, "Keep your grey hair and wrinkles, you look good that way"? It's all potions and makeovers and hair dyes. And what's worse, they're all advertised by women who wouldn't need them for years.
I'm quite happy to look my age, and I'm not bothered about my wrinkles. But I just wish there were a few older women advertising these products. Well, I'm not seen as a grey-haired granny here.
This is my job. I'm taken seriously. I have status. But not everyone can keep on working. 65 and that's it. It's a rotten waste.
Verdi composed great music in his 70s. Jessica Tandy starred in Driving Miss Daisy at 80. Picasso was still painting at 90. And at 70, Churchill led the country to victory.
If you want to keep working, 65 is a pretty stupid cut-off point.
Surely we should be judged on something other than our age.
One day we'll all be old if we're lucky. I don't want to fight it, and I don't want to look and act young just to be accepted. I'm an older woman being my age, and it's the best time of my life.
The best time of her life, and she means that.
Then I did 10 years as a guardian, where again I was on the other side. I was hearing what people thought about the care system from families, and felt there was a deficit in our thinking. So I saw this advert for the School for Social Entrepreneurs, where the strapline was for hard-headed and well-intentioned, something like that, which sort of rather appealed because it seemed as though it was going to be business-like. And so I applied. I was 70 then. In the group that was interviewing, there was about 4 people, and one of these people was someone called Michael Young, who unbelievably I had not connected to what had been really a classic book on my social work course, Kinship Care in East London, Wilmot and Young. I had not connected him to that Michael Young. And so when I started talking about the project I would like to do would be to explore grandparenting and explore why, as a bureaucracy, we had not really explored all the relations of a child, the network, before we placed them with strangers, or at least if we had to have them in foster care for a short while, why we didn't go on exploring through something that I later knew would be called family group conferences, to find out what the strengths of the family were. So he was mightily interested in this. He absolutely sat up and took notice. And I learned afterwards, of course, is because he had not really left that work he'd done in the 50s and 60s, even though we were now in the 80s, 1999 still. I picked up a leaflet in the office at Bethnal Green about Winston Churchill travelling fellowships. So I said to Michael, look, why don't I go across to America, try for one of these fellowships and go to America to find out what they're doing there, because I had read quite a lot that they were about 10 years ahead of us there. It seemed very simple at the time. You know, you are going to explore the extended family, train social workers how to work with generations, and I thought it would all be very simple. But here we are many years on, and it still has some people who question the whole thing. It just felt like something that, you know, we had to do, and I had access to Michael. I mean, he was really my mentor for the 4 years from 1998 till he died, 2002.
So tell us about the formation of Grandparents Plus then.
You see, the year 1999 had come to an end, so I was still meeting a lot with Michael to sort of, you know, get on with this, starting this new organisation. It coincided, didn't it, with Bill getting
September.
meningitis, and Michael, something happened with the government. They were sort of, I think, slightly focused on the extended family, or something happened, and he said he was very keen on the word zeitgeist, and he said, Jean, this is the zeitgeist, we've got to launch now. I mean, there were a lot of hospital visits with Dad, with Bill. So I decided to go and try to raise awareness, actually, of the extended family, and try to move away from what I knew the culture was of the focus on parents and children. And there were no family policies, so we were also beginning to talk to the government.
We're in 2012 now. If in say 2015 your organisation had been able to really do everything, or it was really making its way to doing what you really wanted it to do, and say you were being interviewed by a journalist about the success that you had brought about in the last few years, what would you be saying was now happening? So it's 2015. It's 3 years' time. You know, what would you say is now happening?
Well, it's about systems, isn't it? A system would be that everybody acknowledging that where you look first, which is what children ask us to do, is the extended family, and you don't, you exhaust the extended family before you move on to thinking of other plans for children. You make sure that you have tapped into the strength of the extended family and that you have searched even for that one person that will give that child security and love. So we are where we are. I think in those 10 years, is it? 11 years. I think we've done quite well, really. But there's a whole lot more to do.
Okay.
There's certainly a lot more to do, and here we are now in 2015, and I'm going to be joined on stage by Elaine Arnold, Elaine Farmer, Joan Hunt, John Simmons and Anne Longfield, just to reflect both on Jean's influence and on the influence of Grandparents Plus to this very day. So, could you welcome our guests? Conducting this from here, but Joan, can we start with you? Thank you very much for joining us. Could you tell us a bit about what influence you think Jean has had on the agenda that you're working and what was significant about Jean's approach?
Well, I was going to get something out which I read this morning.
Can you use the mic as well?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I met Jean when she, I think, first came back from America. And she came to Oxford and talked about what she'd been doing. And at that time I'd become interested in this whole area of kinship care. And I was just astonished by this amazing woman who was in her 70s, should have been retiring, and in her retirement was bringing all this passion about trying to make sure that local authorities, social workers, thought first, as it said in that video, about the extended family and about embedding it. And when I was sort of thinking about what I might say today, I looked at a chapter that Jean had written in a book in 2001 about kinship care. And I found an agenda for action, which, and Jean said, she wanted to bring about a sea change in social work attitudes, to make kinship care the first and preferred placement of choice. She wanted to tackle ageism, to emphasise family decision-making, move from a deficit model to strength model, develop a different form of family assessment and develop support services, generate research evidence, and provide assistance with legal costs. What Jean has done is to move us a considerable way along that road, which she had the vision to spell out in such detail in 2001. And she did it partly personally by going around and disseminating and raising enthusiasm. She also did it by setting up Grandparents Plus, which is an amazing legacy. And through Grandparents Plus, both as an organisation and as an organisation which works with other charities in the Kinship Care Alliance, I think we have moved a long way along that road. There's lots to do, but to create this sort of organisation at any stage in life would be remarkable. To do it when you're in your 70s and to go on into your 80s and to be actively involved, I think, is amazing, and she's had an enormous influence. And I want to thank her personally, actually, because she's been enormously helpful to me She loaned me articles, put me in touch with people, and all the way through has been enormously supportive of research, as I think other people here would say.
And I suspect everyone will share that in terms of the support that Jean gave us all in terms of making things happen.
Yeah.
Elaine Farmer, in terms of your research work, and what influence has Jean had on that? You're also a trustee at Grandparents Plus, I should add.
Yes, well, when I was doing my first study on kinship care, Jean phoned me and introduced herself and shared her enormous enthusiasm for improving the situation for kinship carers. And we kept in touch, and then when the research findings came out, they were exactly as she would have expected, showing enormous deficits in the support for kinship carers, and at the same time, very, very good outcomes for the children brought up by them. They compare very favourably, they do better than children in other forms of care. So what came out of that was that Jean and I started doing training in local authorities, and Mark joined us, and Jean brought a role play along, and I talked about the research. And so we did that in several local authorities, and one of the many things she did in that, as you can imagine, she was an extremely good trainer, was she'd at some point just feed in this commentary on ageism and point out that, you know, one of the ways in which we failed to value kinship carers was when they were grandparents, they were older and seen as, you know, less valuable in some way. So we kept in touch ever since, and she'd phone me from time to time, and she'd say, I'm really concerned about this particular issue. There's a new adoption thing, and what do you think? I think children should be going to kinship carers are being adopted. What do you think? Blah, blah, blah. And we'd have marvellous, you know, she was very much, of course, had her finger on the pulse. I didn't always agree with her, but, you know, she was always very well informed and really inspirational. And I think what, as everybody's been saying, what's so obvious just from seeing Jean on the screen is that she had it all in all the things you want. She was an activist to the core. She was extremely tenacious and very warm and empathetic, and that is an absolutely amazing combination. And it enabled her, through her persistence, as many people have said, and as Joan just said, to make a huge difference through the work she did, the networks of support she set up. She set up a professionals group for kinship care workers, which is still going, and all the outputs from Grandparents Plus as it got stronger and stronger to the very, very powerful organisation that it is today, the lobbying efforts and the work, that I think there's still a long way to go, but she had a very big influence. And one thing the more I think about Jean, the more I feel she is an exemplar of a cracking good social worker. I wouldn't say that to many people, and I've never heard anyone say they've done a social work course, and it was paradise. That was, for me, a revelation.
Thank you, Elaine. Can I turn to Elaine Arnold, who was one of the first trustees of Grandparents Plus. Elaine, can you tell us a bit about Jean's appreciation of diversity and different cultural perspectives on kinship care, which I know she was particularly focused on?
Yes. I first met Jean at a conference, a Bowlby conference, talking about attachment, separation, and loss. I entered the room and I thought, where shall I sit? I look for somebody who looks friendly. And this lady smiled at me, and I sat next to her. And right away, she asked, and what do you do? And I said, I was a social worker, but now I run a group looking at people who were left as children with their grandmothers. And that was the switch for her to tell me about Grandparents Plus and how she was co-founder with Michael Young. And she would very much like me to come and talk about the experiences of the Caribbean people. She told me she had some connection with Caribbean people, and she heard that I worked in Trinidad. And there we had this connection from the start. And she was so interested to know how grandparents in the Caribbean were given the opportunity to look after their children. And she thought that we should really develop this here in England, where a number of Caribbean children were being placed in care. And then she invited me to be a trustee, and it went on from then. Our friendship grew, and we discussed. We attended conferences together. She attended conferences that my organization put on, and she would always say, "It's the best conference I go to, the warmth and the feeling that I belong." And she was really one of us.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Elaine. And next to you, John. Looking forward, John, I mean, what do you think Jean would have wanted for children and families in the future?
I just think I need to weave a perspective from the past into that. Jean created my family. In the 1970s, my wife and I, Gail, wanted to adopt, and Camden, I worked for Camden, and so I was allocated a senior person to undertake the assessment of our suitability. And there's a long story about all of that. But Jean, I mean, everything that we know about Jean, as a client of hers, Gail as a client of hers, her humanity, her personality, her commitment, she was incredibly fair, supportive, etc. It was a part of our experiences. So all the kind of anxieties that we had in whether we would ever be approved was something that she was responsible for. She then stayed involved in us through the placement of our daughter and then our son in 1980 and 1986. And she visited us regularly until just very shortly before she passed away. So if there was anything about a kind of social worker creating a kinship network, that was definitely our personal experience. She knew how to do that par excellence and every one of the kind of qualities which have been reflected on through the course of this evening. We experienced in spades, as I said, right up to just before she died. And as a part of that, that included the birth of our first granddaughter, which she also helped us celebrate and actually left a very significant and powerful memento. So kind of, I think that they're the kinds of qualities that I would, she drove those issues forward in such a powerful way and had such an enormous impact through her tenacity, her insight, her determination, on creating an organization and creating a perspective that recognized the importance of family and the extended family in all its many ways. I think one of the interesting things for me just recently, I mean, 2011, 12, and then 13 particularly, the Supreme Court, in a particular judgment, which has had a huge impact on the family placement sector, really resonated in its own statements the importance of the family, and that local authorities and society at large must never forget in the difficult decisions that it had to make where children come into care, that family comes first, and we break that and lose that at its peril. And that's gone on, I think, to have quite a significant impact in the way that policy and practice is actually developing at the moment. But I have to say that at the same time, while that was an issue which was highlighted in the Labour Party manifesto, it wasn't in the Conservative Party manifesto, and in fact the only issue that they came close to was reinforcing the message about adoption. And that's one of the concerns that I have at the moment, because it's one of the issues that is in a bill which is before Parliament at the moment, and it doesn't really kind of build on what we've come to know, what the Supreme Court has told us to think about. So those issues continue to ring through the sector, and I don't have any doubt that it has a place in the sector, but yes, we need Jean and the memory of Jean really to drive that policy and practice framework together. And I think that an event like this, as powerful and influential as it is, will remind us that, that their energy needs to be directed in that particular way.
Thank you, John. And Anne Longfield, just thinking about more broadly in terms of Jean's influence on the family sector and her influence on your work, and particularly when you were Chief Executive of 4 Children.
Sure. Well, Jean walked into my office as well. She said she wanted to see me and came along. And I can't quite remember why I'd come to her attention. She'd read something somewhere that had been written, and she decided that I needed to recognise a few things. I've got to say, looking now at any discussion of the family, and children and families, it would be unimaginable not to have mention of extended families and grandparents and the like. But only 15 years ago, which is what this was at the time, there was that feeling that grandparents weren't really, they were a bit kind of unorganisable for governments. Sometimes they were quite costly and not quite as neat as other areas of family policy. But as soon as Jean walked through that door, I realised that all was about to change forever, both for me, but then she relentlessly was seeing lots of other people too. And from that day, Jean reminded me that as far as children are concerned, then, of course, the role of grandparents was one that was enriching and valuable and often an anchor in a child's life, that actually grandparents were delivering more childcare than the Exchequer could ever count into worth, if they ever got round to that. And then in terms of offering that kind of ongoing stability and support that kinship carers could do, then that really was another important element. And I've got to say, she never, ever stopped reminding me that, which I was very grateful of, but also from that moment onwards, which was a bit of a light bulb moment, I think, for everyone who was in that room at that time, actually, there was a difference in approach. We always looked then at the extended family. Jean went on to work with us on something we call the Family Commission, going all around the country, talking to families, actually with Esther Ranson as well. And at every point, we remembered the extended family and the importance of grandparents there because Jean was part of that. And I've got to say, from that moment onwards, Jean was always in the room when we made any policy discussion or any policy decision, and remains so to this day. And I do think that in terms of children and family policy more broadly, we couldn't actually have got to the point of seeing grandparents as absolutely so intrinsic to every possible aspect of family life without Jean's input, for which, of course, we're really grateful.
Thank you, Anne. Anne's phrase about Jean always being in the room, I'm sure she's here tonight, but very clearly, but she's always in the room when we have trustees meetings at Grandparents Plus 2, constantly reminding us and making sure we stick faithfully to the mission. But Anne, you're now Children's Commissioner. Still relatively new, but I just think with that hat on, can you tell us something about Jean's legacy beyond what you already talked about?
Well, I think really that there has often been somewhat of a division in thinking between organisations and charities that looked at children and looked at families and increasingly looked at grandparents too. But actually, what Jean taught me at part of that light bulb moment, and what I've always gone on to talk about with others, is really that we don't live our lives as individuals, which no one here would do, but often in policy terms, people think about aspects of the family as individuals, aspects of a child as individuals. Well, actually, Jean's agenda for action, to see people as a whole, to see families as a whole, and to see us as part of communities, is one that, I carry strongly and want to see as part of anything I do. And when we hit, the point where we all realised, there was an economic recession and we really had to look again at how we could support families, and there was all the talk of less for more. One of the things I just said constantly, and again, Jean was always with me, is, at a time when as a country we don't have many assets, actually, We have huge assets with families and huge assets with grandparents within that. And if we can support that, that doesn't mean that other services aren't needed and shouldn't be there, but actually there's a strength there that, again, we ignore at our peril. So for me, as children's commissioners now, seeing children within the breadth and the richness of the family, still needing support often along the way, but actually being able to harness that strength was really something Jean not only taught me then, but I will take forward and carried with me.
Thank you very much, Anne. I think that's a great point to end this particular section on. Thank you to John, Elaine, Joan, and Anne. Now, one last section on social work and kinship care as it is today, and I'd like to invite Sue Connell and Maxine Campbell to join us on stage. Sue Connell is a social worker who is working with the kinship care professionals group that Jean set up, and Maxine Campbell, as you all know now, is a kinship carer. And I'm just going to ask both of them a couple of quick questions. Sue, if you'd like to sit there with the microphone. And Maxine, thank you. Sue, can you just tell us a bit about Jean's influence on you as a social worker who's working today in kinship care and as a member of the kinship care group for professionals?
I'll certainly try. Yeah, I think Jean reminds us all of the journey that each kinship carer has, how individual it is, that you can't say, oh, here's all the kinship carers, that each one has had quite a journey to get there. And so when I'm working with families at Wandsworth, I have to bear that in mind and often think, what would Jean think about this? And we're reminded to care for the carers.
And kind of the lasting influence of Jean on your work?
I think just to remind us that how important each one is, each family member is, each kinship carer is, and to think when we meet with the group together to see a different perspective that's different from if you're in your social work office, speaking to your manager. It's a different kind of reflection. And I always admired her frankness and the way that she challenged the social workers to make us think even more, and her combination of honesty and warmth made me want to keep coming back for more.
Thank you, Sue. And turning to Maxine, thank you very much, Maxine, for joining us and for writing the letter that everyone has had this evening, a really personal letter from you. Could you tell us about your experience as a kinship carer and how Grandparents Plus has helped you?
It's a long story, which I won't go into all of it, but I started my journey in 2012. My niece was in local authority care at the time, and thrown into a sea of unknowing of how am I going to get this little girl out of care. I was approached by a local authority as a short-term carer. They did an assessment, which they told me at the end was positive, and I thought, great. And at the beginning of the journey, I thought I was here to help. It was my sister's child, and I thought I was here to help my sister, get her child back. And then it changed, and it changed dramatically. They no longer wanted me short-term, they wanted me long-term, but yet they didn't place the child with me, continued to keep her in care. She was there for 13 months, and it was an absolute fight, and I thank God for Grandparents Plus. I came to know them through my dad and his wife, who have care of my other niece. So they'd already been through the process and said I could get advice from Grandparents Plus, and it was such a relief to talk to people that actually were pointing me in a direction, because up until that point, social workers were, we're here to help you, but yeah, actually, well, no, you haven't provided me with, a whole list of things, and I'm like, well, I don't know what to provide you. And Grandparents Plus were really there as a great support, legally, financially, and putting things into perspective somewhat in the beginning. And then once my niece was placed with me, there became more issues, unexpected things that I hadn't had time to think out or to foresee, or to envisage would happen. And again, Grandparents Plus were there again. And then I was invited along to a conference at the House of Commons. And I can remember distinctly being there and just kind of really overwhelmed by all the other kinship carers that were in the room and their stories. And it was just so heartbreaking to know that actually these are all people that had positioned themselves and given up so much of their lives to take on these children, and yet there was no support out there. And it did break my heart. But at the same time, it was also a sense of relief that, gosh, I'm not the only one. But sad to think that actually I should really be the only one, because it really shouldn't be like this. And, Jean is really, she's a great inspiration. And just hearing her life today is inspiring me and spurring me on more. I'm trying to do work myself to bring an awareness to kinship care and the support that we need, and working alongside the North London Adoption and Fostering Consortium. And there are changes, that are coming, and, Grandparents Plus and the vision of Jean is really what's helped me to be where I am today, and I'm extremely grateful.
Brilliant. Thank you, Maxine. You're a great champion for kinship carers. Thank you to Maxine and thank you to Sue. Can I just urge you to read Maxine's letter that you received on arrival this evening, and to support the work of Grandparents Plus, so that we can, in Jean's memory, and so we can continue to help more and more families and more children, and to keep Jean's flame burning. In a few minutes you'll be able to share your memories with each other, but before then, the final words of the evening will focus on the last phase of Jean's life. In this section we'll hear from a former trustee of Grandparents Plus and a friend of Jean's, who is Jill Curtis, who also ran a grandparents group herself. Jean's family will then bring the event to a close, and we will watch Jean's swan song, a video of Jean's friends, Jean receiving her OBE, and other moments. Can I thank you again for joining us this evening, and thank you for joining this appreciation of Jean Stogdon.
As you get older, you don't often get the chance to make a new, very close friend. Well, I did, and that was Jean. Jean and I spoke on the telephone and emailed for quite some time over grandparenting issues, because she was interested in the group that I was running. But one day she rang me, and I had to say to her, my husband's just died. And she said, so has mine. Then within a heartbeat, she said, we must meet. We'll meet at the National Theatre early in the morning. There are dark corners because we'll probably cry, and we can sit and have a coffee. So we met, we did cry, we did hold hands, and the whole friendship blossomed from there. One time we were at the National Film Theatre having lunch, and over the loudspeaker they kept saying the film was starting, but we were going to an exhibition. But after a while, Jean said, oh, I've just heard it's my favourite film, It's a Wonderful Life. Let's ditch the exhibition and go to the films. So we raced along and got our tickets, went into the cinema, only a handful of people there, sat down in the front, and suddenly a Frenchman stood up, and he said, this is a very violent film, and it was very difficult for us to make. It was very dangerous. We hope you won't be offended by the violence. By this time, Jean and I held hands again, and this film started, which was about the gangs in Paris, in the suburbs, and how people get knifed and there are drugs. And by this time, we didn't know where to put ourselves. And I kept digging, Jean. You said this was your favorite film. This isn't the film you wanted to see. When it finished and we were quivering, the few people that were there slipped out. But because we were in the front row, and because we'd been very nicely brought up, we didn't dare stand up and go out when this French director came up again and talked and wanted to know if anyone wanted to ask questions, and we didn't. But forever after, I only had to say to Jean, "It's a wonderful life," and we would really laugh. The last time I saw Jean, we had lunch, and it turned into a very long lunch, because she was talking about the very serious illness that she had and how she was dealing with chemo and the effect on her, how she was dealing with this, and her worry about the effect her illness was having on the family. We began to talk about our own mortality and how we will have to leave our families one day. And we even talked about our funerals. Now, actually, it was a very funny lunch. Please don't think we were very grim about this, but we shared a lot of thoughts, a lot of laughter, and a lot of love. I know from the bottom of my heart that Jean would have been very pleased the way this evening has gone and the way she's been remembered. And like all of you here, I miss Jean so much.
Middle of the night, I just couldn't breathe. I just felt I could not breathe, which was very frightening. And ambulance called again. And so I got into hospital literally the last day in February, and everything accelerated at a very great rate. And I was in intensive care. The family were told I probably wouldn't survive. Rather than panicking because I couldn't breathe, I actually thought, well, this is like swimming. I'll concentrate on my breathing. And every breath was a terrible effort. And the doctor leant over me at one point and said, look, we can put you out for a whole week. We can give you general anaesthetic, in other words, I suppose life support, taking away me struggling for breath. The machines would do the struggling. And I just somehow, at the back of my mind, even in that state, thought, hang on a sec, I've still got to come out of that at the end of the week, and surely that's going to be harder. It wiped out my kidneys, absolutely finished them off. It's wonderful having the group of women friends I've got, and I get an enormous amount out of talking to them, and most of them, certainly probably about 10 of them, I mean, I can have conversations, we can talk for about 3 hours, largely about us and where we are in our lives, what it's like getting older, and then hugely about our families, what's happening to the family, what's happening to our grandchildren. And of course, you know, every family is having its conflicts, and really I've got to the stage where I think at certain times all families are dysfunctional. You know, they go along on a good patch and then something happens and it's a rocky patch. It's a bit like, I suppose, all relationships really. So my women friends are an enormous source of comfort.
When you're down and troubled and you need some love and care, and nothing is going right, close your eyes and think of me, and soon I will be there to brighten up even your darkest night. You just call out my name, and you know wherever I am, winter, spring, summer, or fall. All you have to do is call, and I'll be there. You've got a friend.
Really been quite amazing that, you know, it seemed to be 1 minute I was in intensive care and not expected to live, and then it seemed almost the next minute I get something through the letterbox from the cabinet office to say that I was going to get an OBE for work with families and children, which was really an enormous thrill, and felt like quite a sort of the good side of life after a very bad side of life, really. Just to say that we're down here at the moment on holiday, which is absolutely lovely, because I really never thought I'd make coming down here, and it's been absolutely wonderful. We've done all the lovely things, just ordinary things, looking at the views, going for walks, haven't been for a paddle yet, going to have lunch at Porthokin and Body Groyce we've been to today, and just doing all the lovely things, and just being here in Minadon, which is a total life-enhancing thing to do.
That's great.
Hello, is this working? Could I ask for Sam and Stephen and Peter to come up on the stage, please? I'm sorry. It's better you are than I am. It's okay. It's all right. It's okay. All right. Okay.
I planned this whole thing so I wouldn't have to be up here because I knew I would cry, so this is naughty.
Well, I'm glad you're doing it for me. I'm Mark, Jean's youngest son, in case some of you don't know. I think Jean has been truly appreciated this evening, hasn't she? So I'm really pleased. It's very hard to be on the stage here, and I would first of all like to thank everyone who's been brave enough to be on here. It's not just a performance because people are feeling things from their heart, and like how do you perform when actually you're connected to that feeling as well. So I'm really, really grateful, and people have really put Mum across so well from my perspective, which is just wonderful. I'd like to thank everyone who is sort of from behind the scenes. You know, there's loads of people, as you can see, operating all kinds of different things, and I'm really grateful for that. It's all worked very, very smoothly. I need water. There's some here. Ooh. God, I'm shaking. You're crying, I'm shaking. That's all. Okay, so thank you all for, and it will continue afterwards when we go outside and have some food and drinks. So thank you, thank them. It's always those invisible people, as women often are, as Mum would say. I'd particularly like to thank Sam and Stephen, who have supported the idea of appreciation from the beginning. We met very, very soon after Mum died, and we really continue to work together very, very well about that. This evening wouldn't have been possible to the sort of the level of quality and sort of connectedness in terms of the video material if it hadn't been for Peter, who's a remarkable young man. I'd like to thank him on behalf of Jean, of Mum, our Mum. She would have loved to have met you, Peter. And, and I'm sorry she hasn't, but maybe she is looking on somewhere. Okay. It has been a great evening, I think. It's been a wonderful evening. Thank you all very much for coming as well, and just seeing you here. And, on behalf of my brothers and I and all the family, it's just such a wonderful thing for us to hold in our hearts forever. It's just lovely. Thank you. I thought it would be hot and flowers this time of the year, so I just want to. This is Penhaligon's soap, Bluebell. Mum talked about Bluebell soap sometimes was a thing that got her through really difficult times in hospital. It's a lovely scent if people don't know it. So this is for you, Sam. And for the non-Bluebell people, the English fern people, Peter and Stephen. Thank you very much, and thanks for your sharing this evening, Peter. Stephen, it's wonderful. Lastly, I just want to talk about, Grandparents Plus, beyond the family and friends legacy of Jean, and Mum, which, you all can feel for yourselves. Grandparents Plus will be hopefully here, or in another name or another form, maybe for hundreds of years beyond today. And so can you please continue to support it in whichever way you can, financially, with yourselves, with your skills, and just your sort of commitment to Mum's sort of passion. Please let that continue with all of you. So we've had a different time here today. I think we've had some laughs, and we've cried, and we felt sad. We perhaps felt a bit stunned by things tonight. I certainly have. I've seen all these recordings a number of times, hundreds of times. Just to say that, I mean, if there are people out there who know about this business, probably for every minute that you've watched, it's been 1 or 2 hours of preparation time, which is, you mustn't hear that, Sam, because of the Grandparents Plus budget. But it's a lot of work, to do 4 minutes of putting things together to make it fit and to feel right. It's a lot of work.
And also, if there's anyone out there who's in the film business or the theatre business, please think about Peter, because he's a fantastic asset to any organisation. And I'm sad he's leaving Grandparents Plus, because I think he shouldn't. He might not be good. That's good to hear. So please go forward and enjoy the next bit, have some nice food and drink, and have a lovely evening. And just think of Mum, and she would love you to be enjoying yourselves. Thank you very much.